And so, good evening. This is going to be the last session of Thursday Nights in Revelation for 2021. We're going to take a 2-week break, and then we'll pick it up again the first Thursday in January. So stay tuned for that. But tonight we're going to get into another look at that one central figure that we find in the book of Revelation. He's called the beast from the sea. He's called the man of sin. He's called a number of different things. A lot of popular theologians, eschatologists call him the Antichrist, even though that word is not used by John. But that's who we're going to be talking about, the second person of what we can call the unholy trinity that we find in Revelation 13. So we're going to start in Revelation 13. And we're just going to look at the first verse, and it's just kind of a refresher for us, a reminder for us before we branch off and we get into the meat of the study that we're going to have tonight. All right. Hopefully you'll be able to see my screen and follow along as I get this together. So we're going to start in verse 1, chapter 13. John, the apostle, is writing. He said, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." Okay, so we have been going through the book of Daniel, and we've been looking at the prophecies that were revealed to Daniel as he has written them down. And we've talked about how he has talked and referred to the future times and the future empires that would arise from Babylon to the Medo-Persian Empire to Greece. And then we see this fourth one, and some people call it Rome, but we see that there's a little bit more, I think, to this last fourth beast in Daniel 7 than just the Roman Empire. And we see that little horn, and we've seen this little horn stand up and rise up and speak blasphemous names. And we've seen how especially in chapter 8 we've seen a kind of a double fulfillment in how it was fulfilled in the Seleucid king called Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV. It was fulfilled there, but it's also got a dual fulfillment with this beast from the sea in Revelation 13. So we are going to go now and take a look. We're going to pick up the reading in Daniel chapter 9. So if you want to open your Bibles there, we're going to start in verse 20. We'll start reading there in verse 20. If you want to, you can look on the screen, and I have it here sharing it. But in the first part of Daniel 9, Daniel is in prayer. He's praying and he's repenting, not only himself, but for the sins of his nation, the sins of his people. And he's brokenhearted. He's horrified at all that's happened to Israel over the time that he's experiencing this, and then combine that with the prophecy. And so we'll pick it up here in verse 20, and I'll start reading here. Now, while I was speaking, Daniel is the one that's written this here. "While I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, 'O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of the supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, you are greatly beloved, and therefore consider the matter and understand the vision.'" I have to stop there and look at this and just be amazed for a moment at the intimacy that goes on between Daniel and God that's conveyed here, communicated by Gabriel. Gabriel's message at the beginning of his prayers. Notice he says in verse 23, the command went out. And so you see a couple of things there, don't you? Number one, that God heard his prayer. And then number two, God responded to that prayer. And what was the response? In verse 23, what was that response? Gabriel comes back with the orders. I've got a message for you, Daniel. Do you see it?
It's so personal.
Yes. You are greatly loved.
Mine says highly esteemed.
Highly esteemed. Yeah. New King James says greatly beloved. But you get the picture, don't you? Oh, Daniel, you can almost hear God say, angels, come here. Gabriel, come here. Man, I love this guy. You go tell him I love him. You can almost see that, can't you? Oh my goodness. This is something else. And then God says, now consider this and understand what I'm about to tell you. So all of this is not happening in the context of, an angry, wrathful God that's about to render judgment and righteousness and purity, even though he is. But you see this level of intimacy still with Daniel. That's just, it's remarkable. And consider and keep in mind, this is all before Christ. This is all before Jesus went to the cross, and the Holy Spirit was available now to Daniel. He's striving and seeking after God, and yet God says, oh, Daniel, you're loved. Now I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. So I wanted you to catch that. And so we're going to dive in a little bit more now. We get into verse 24. It says 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. 70 weeks are determined. Now, the word weeks there in the New King James, you probably have something else, don't you? Hopefully you have something else. Deb, what do you have in yours?
77s.
77s, and that's more accurate. 77s. Now, what's meant by that? It's going to be important to kind of make a distinction between the Hebrew mind, the Jewish mind, and the Western mind. Our Western minds think in terms of tens, don't we? When we count things out, we count them in increments of 10. And so that's kind of we're in a base 10 kind of numerical system. The Jewish mind, though, thought in terms of sevens. Okay, so you can see that all through the Old Testament, that there were 7 days in a week, that the seventh day was going to be a Sabbath, and the seventh year for your land was going to be the land of Sabbath. And after 7 sevens, you had the year of Jubilee, and there was another festival. And so everything was built in sevens. And so that's where they thought. Okay. So when we talk about 77s, that's going to be important to keep in mind. Okay. So we're talking about 70 periods of 7 years. And that's going to be the context, 70 periods of 7 years. Okay, so that's going to be important. Keep that in mind. 70 periods of 7 years are determined for your people and your city. Okay, now who are the people and who are the city? What is the city?
Jerusalem?
Jerusalem is a city.
Jews.
The Jews are the people. Okay, so that's, again, speaking to Daniel, that's going to be the Jews and for Jerusalem. Okay, so now 70 periods of 7 years are determined for the Jews and for Jerusalem. And so here's a whole list of things that are going to happen in the 70 periods of 7 years. Number one, there's going to be a finish to the transgression. Number two, an end of sin, to make an end of sins. Number three, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Now, so notice the similarities here. Notice the things that are in common: transgression, sins, and iniquity. And notice what's happening here each time. Transgressions are finished, sins are made an end of, and then there's reconciliation made for iniquity. So when did that happen? What event is that pointing to?
When the exiles came back, came back to Jerusalem? No?
Keep going further. Further ahead.
Well, they built the temple again. They rebuilt the temple.
Well, when were the transgression, the sins, and the iniquities all dealt with once and for all?
Jesus.
At the cross.
At the cross. Okay, so there's that event. Okay, so there's 70 periods of 7 years. So this is what's going to happen in the period of that. That doesn't mean that once that happens, everything's over. Okay, that's included in the 70 periods of 7 years. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now notice, look at the next three: to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay, so what does that point to? When is all that going to happen? Everlasting righteousness is brought in. All visions and prophecy are sealed up. In other words, they're completely fulfilled. It's a wrap. Don't have to keep looking to see when it's going to be fulfilled. And the most holy is going to be anointed as the most holy. When's all that going to happen?
Second coming?
Second coming. Yes.
I got one right.
You got it. All right. So this is all that's going to happen in the period of 70 periods of 7 years. The 77s, the cross and the second coming. Those are the two things that are going to take place. Okay, you with me now? So far, so good? All right, let's go then to verse 25. We continue. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. Okay, so let's go back and let's look at the periods again that are mentioned here in verse 25. There are not 77s now, but now there's a delineation. There's a division in here, isn't there? What's the division? Instead of 77s, there's now what?
62.
62 and
7.
And it's important, don't just combine it and say 69. It's very important to distinguish the two. Okay, it's important, and I'll tell you why. The 7 periods of 7 years that would be 49 years, wouldn't it? Okay, so what's that referring to? Okay, it's going to refer from one moment to another moment. Okay, and here's the moment when this begins, and this actually is what I believe the time of this 70 periods of 7 years begin. Okay, and it's at the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem. Okay, now Deb, you were touching on the return from the exile just a little bit earlier. Does anybody remember how that went down? I mean, who was the king that was in charge? What was the decree? What do you remember from your history, if anything?
Cyrus?
Cyrus was one of the kings. Yes, he was one of the. Darius was another king.
Oh.
Okay, but there were actually 4 different edicts, 4 different decrees that came in 4 different times. Okay, but none of them filled completely what was mentioned here in verse 25. Okay, Cyrus and to a certain extent Darius told the Jews, you can go back to Jerusalem and you can rebuild your temple. Okay, but that was not a political threat. That would not make Israel or the Jews a political threat. It wouldn't make them a military threat. Okay, none of that would do it. But if you think a little bit further, you think of Ezra being one who helped rebuild the temple.
Oh, Nehemiah and the wall.
Yes, Nehemiah and the wall. And so when Artaxerxes issued the permit, gave him the permission to rebuild the wall, notice if you go back and look at this, the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, not just the temple, but also the wall. Now look at the rest of this verse. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. Okay, so this is pointing to Artaxerxes giving Nehemiah the green light to go forward to rebuild the wall. So that's when the clock started ticking, from that moment. Now, you might recall that it only took Nehemiah something like 50 some odd days, 52 days to build the wall. But if you remember before that, there was a lot of junk, a lot of rubble all over the city, wasn't there? And, they didn't have backhoes and caterpillars and bobcats to pick up, and skip loaders to pick up all this stuff. So they had to do it the best they could. And it was slow work. And so all of the cleanup after that, even after the wall, took time. And so it's entirely plausible that the 7-year period was the point from the time that Artaxerxes said, green light, go, rebuild the wall, to the time where they said, all right, we've got everything cleaned up, we got the wall in place, and we're good. So I think so that would be referring to that first period of 7. That's the 7 weeks, okay, the 7 sevens. It would take roughly 49 years. Okay, everybody with me now? Still there? I haven't lost anybody? Questions on it? Okay. All right. Now, then, so now we've got the first 7. All right. 7 weeks down, 63 more to go. Okay. So now we go to verse 26. And we read and we find this, and after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Okay, there's a lot there, isn't there? Okay, so let's go after this, after the 62 weeks or the 62 sevens. So when you multiply that out, that's 434 years. And so we're looking at the completion of the wall and Jerusalem being restored. We go forward roughly 434 days, and we go 434 years, and that brings us right up to Palm Sunday when Jesus enters into Jerusalem. So we got 62 weeks. So notice that it was at that point that Jesus went into Jerusalem. Now, everybody, you remember how he did that, don't you? What did he come? What did he come riding on?
A donkey.
Donkey. And what did that symbolize? What did that represent?
A man of peace.
Man of peace. Okay, he's coming in peaceful terms. All right, and so as such, he's fulfilling Zechariah 9:9. Now, if you look on my screen, I've got it up here for you. It says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." Your king is coming to you. So notice that Jesus is coming into Jerusalem. I am your king. I am Messiah. I'm the one that was promised to you.
Yeah.
And so they threw the palm branches down, Hosanna, Hosanna. But did they really receive him as king?
No.
No. So after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. And what does the cutting off point to?
His crucifixion.
The crucifixion. They took him and they crucified him. Okay, so he was cut off, and not for himself, but not for himself and the people of the prince who is to come. Now here's where we got to stop and we got to scratch our head, and this is where, Jim, you go and look at all your commentators, they probably go like this. I don't mind do. They go everywhere with this. Okay, but here's after I've looked at this is what I'm landing on. The people of the prince who is to come is pointing to the beast. It's pointing to the man that we read about in Revelation 13. That's the prince who is to come. Now, now some of the commentators will back up and say, no, that's Rome, that's Titus, who came in and leveled Jerusalem in 70 AD. Okay, and so it's pointing to the Roman Empire. Okay, but the problem with that I see is if you keep reading on, it says he shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Okay, so yes, the temple was flattened. Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But here is where the curveball comes. You ready? All right. And this verse 27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And then it continues on. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. All right, there's a big drink of water, isn't there? Okay, so notice here that here's that covenant with many for a week. Now, what have we talked about that the beast will do? There's going to be that contract that he's going to make with Israel to restore the sacrificial system. You can go back and you can worship. You know, the implication is that there will be a temple rebuilt that will be a place for the Jews to go and to offer up sacrifice. He'll do that with Israel, and they'll have a 7-year agreement. But then halfway through is when he breaks it off. Okay, and that's what's pointed to in verse 27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And that's when he steps in, and we'll read this in chapter 13. The third person of the unholy Trinity, we'll call him the false prophet. He will make an image of the beast from the sea, who popular is known as the Antichrist, and he'll take that image and put it in the most holy place in the temple. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation, Jesus said, standing in the temple where he ought not to be, then everybody, those of you in Judea, Jesus says, you better hightail it out, because it's going to get rough. It's going to be rougher than anything else ever. Okay, so there's the reference. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate. And that's what Jesus was referring to. when he's talking to the disciples, and the disciples are saying, hey, when's the end of the age? And Jesus said, when you see this guy show up, the abomination that causes desolation, standing in the temple, and let, that's spoken of by Daniel, and let the reader understand. Go back and read it again. Understand it is what Jesus is saying. I'm telling you, you better head out. You better run for your lives. Okay, so that's why I think if you go back and you look on my screen here, that this prince who is to come is referring to this beast from the sea, this man of sin that's in Revelation 13. So what does that mean with the 77s or the 70 weeks? It looks right now like 69 of those sevens have already transpired. From the time that Artaxerxes gave Nehemiah the green light to go and rebuild the wall, until the time that Jesus was cut off, he entered Jerusalem as the king and he was rejected as king. That was the end of those 62 sevens, so 62 periods of 7 years. Okay, now it seems that with this prophecy that it's like God pushed pause and we're not going forward with the 70 weeks. So now we've got this interim period, which is the age of the church. Okay, and so here are the heroes, every Gentile given an opportunity to come to Christ, to believe in him, receive everlasting life, to escape this last week that's going to be so terrible. And so it's been pushed pause, and you can almost see in God's mercy, come on, hurry, get out. Come to me, and I'll protect you. Come to me and I'll deliver you out of this. Come to me and you won't have to go through this. And it won't be until that contract is signed, that agreement is signed between this man of sin, the prince who is to come, the beast of the sea, and Israel to restore and resume the sacrifices again. And again, this covenant. Once this happens, that's when the clock starts ticking again. And we go into the last 7 years, the last week. So I'll stop right there and see if you got questions. See if it all makes sense. What doesn't make sense?
Oh, it's just the beast came in peace. He was a warrior without arrows, and then he got everybody on his side, so to speak, and then he just changed everything in the last 3.5 years, and he said he was going to be God, and he made it miserable for everyone.
Kind of deceptive, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Kind of like the other guy that's in that unholy trinity.
Yeah.
the liar and father of lies. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?
Right.
All right. Good observation. Everybody on board with this? So you're getting it, understanding it. It's kind of making sense, sort of.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Pastor,
Yes,
back in 25 and 26, Daniel mentions the Messiah.
mm-hmm.
Didn't the Jews get the point there, or did they reject him after that?
Well, they were looking for Messiah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
They still are.
they were continuing to look for Messiah, but Messiah in their mind was the conquering king. He was going to be the one, especially in that context, that was going to conquer Rome and establish Israel once again as a sovereign state. a sovereign power. And he was going to be the king, and they were going to be ruling and reigning forever and ever at that point. So they were looking for this, they were looking for this conquering king. And so when Jesus comes and says, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the gospel, I'm your king. If you turn around and start following me, believe this good news that the kingdom of God has come, he would have ushered it in right then, but they didn't. So, and he knew that they wouldn't. So here we've got that prophecy, and he calls it that it's going to take 70 periods of 7 years. Jack, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering what would have happened if you rode a white horse in instead of that donkey like he did.
Well, but the other part to that is that he was coming in peace.
Yeah, I realize that, but
Yeah.
if he was on a white horse, it would seem he was coming as a warrior or something
Well,
to set up his kingdom.
the people of Israel alive, when he does do that, they'll have it all figured out.
Yep.
Pastor,
Yes.
what I get confused is it says 62 weeks, and yet you said 62 times 7 was 434 years. I'm getting confused.
Okay. Remember, the words weeks is literally sevens. And what I'm referring to with sevens is that's referring to years. Okay, so that's seven periods of 7 years. So the weeks actually is years, if that makes sense. Okay,
So 7 times 52.
so 62 sevens would be 62 periods of 7 years.
Yeah, 434, right?
Does that make sense?
Well, I just can't figure out why it says weeks and you're saying years.
Yeah, well, it's one of those difficult words that's used that it could be understood in different terms, but it's actually the word 7. But going further, it seems that it can't refer to weeks because the numbers don't add up. It can't be 7. It can't be a period of 7 days. That doesn't add up. But the
What's this
years,
says?
the years
62
does.
sevens?
Jack, stop. Jack, but the years do. So when weeks is one attempt to translate it, but the word literally is sevens. And so unfortunately, this is one thing. I love New King James, but that's one place where it kind of drops the ball in the translation. It should say sevens, and it gives you that little footnote up here in verse 24. If you look on my screen, that word weeks there is the Hebrew word shabbat. It means sevens. It means 7, and it's in a plural form. So 7 periods of 7. So if it's 7 days, doesn't work, and it's not days. If it's weeks, still doesn't work. The math doesn't work. But if it refers to 7 years, that word refers to 7 years, then it does work.
Yeah, well, my NIV says 77s, and
Yeah.
and yet on the footnote it says weeks down at the bottom too. So it's
a popular translation that honestly it doesn't work. And that's where if you go with it referring to years and understand that, then the math adds up.
yeah.
So actually, when Daniel wrote down weeks, he himself knew it was years. Is that clear?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to get that, reading it what are we 2,500 years after the fact. It's kind of hard to get the gist. of that. But that's, yeah, that can be, that's an easy one that often trips us up. It's a tough one to get and understand. All right, good
Okay.
questions. Ready to move on? We're going to go to we're going to go to chapter 10. And we're going to go to, actually, we're going to go to verse, well, no, we're actually going to go further. We're going to skip verse 10 or chapter 10. We're going to run through chapter 11 all the way to the very last verse.
Wow. It's a lot.
It's a lot. So we're going to go down to chapter 11 and we're going to, so I got this big old print and it makes it tough. All right. Keep going, keep going, keep going. All right. We'll go to chapter 11 and verse 40. Chapter 11, verse 40. Okay, I'll start reading here. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. Now again, king of the south, if you remember the history that we talked about last week, Alexander the Great conquered wide area of the east of Greece and of Europe and into Asia. He died young. 4 generals, 2 of which rose to prominence, Ptolemy and Seleucid and Seleucid. And so Seleucid was in Syria, Ptolemy was in Egypt. And so the successors to Seleucid and Ptolemy continued to rise up and war against each other. And so in the king of the north is referring to Seleucid and Antiochus, and the king of the south was referring to Ptolemy, who was down in Egypt. And so they were constantly warring back and forth. So just so you know that's who's in view here, focus and pay attention on the king of the north in this passage here. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land. Okay, now this is a reference, remember, about Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. He went against Egypt and Egypt kind of beat him back, and Rome kind of removed him and said, no, you're done doing this. And so what he did, remember, he was trying to use Palestine as kind of a buffer region to keep the Egyptians, keep Ptolemy and Egypt from attacking him all the way up in Syria. So he was trying to use that as kind of a buffer zone. So he went after the glorious land, which is referring to Palestine. So that's where we are right now. He shall enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasure of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east. So he's successful to some degree, but verse 44, but news from the east and from the north, and that's Rome, shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Speaking about Jerusalem, yet he shall come to his end and no one will help him. Okay, so Antiochus you can see the fulfillment there, but this is also pointing to the beast in Revelation 13 and pointing to the fact that he is going to come into Jerusalem. He is going to set himself up in the temple as God. And so notice what he's doing. He's planting the tent of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. So somewhere in there between the Mediterranean Sea and that glorious mountain there in Jerusalem is where he's going to put his palace. And that's where he's going to set up shop as the one single world ruler. So there's a dual fulfillment here. And notice here it says, yet he shall come to his end and no one will help him. And that's what happened to Antiochus, but it's also going to happen to the beast. That's detailed out in Revelation 19. Okay, so now that's important to see, because when you start reading chapter 12, it starts to make a little more sense, because otherwise you're just talking about Michael rising up. And what's happening here? So you have to kind of give it a little bit of context. That's why we read those verses leading up to chapter 12 in verse 1. All right, so here we are. At that time now, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. So remember, this is Gabriel still talking to Daniel. Michael's going to stand up. He's the great prince who's watching over you guys. And notice what he says. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Okay, so there is a time of trouble. And this is typically, Jeremiah calls it Jacob's trouble. If you look on my screen, Jeremiah 30, verse 7, alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. And it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Now that's referring to the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, the great tribulation. That is the time of Jacob's trouble. And that is when Israel is going to be persecuted and hunted like never before. And every follower of Christ who is still obedient and on the earth, they're going to be hunted and persecuted like never before. And that's what Gabriel is saying here. There will be that time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And notice that Gabriel gives the message of hope here. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who was found written in the book. Any guess on what that book might be?
Book of life.
Yep. Now, that's pointing to that moment. Okay. Now, it says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Okay, so there is going to be a resurrection when Jesus comes back the second time. Those tribulation saints, remember them who died, who were killed because they were followers? They're going to be bodily resurrected at that point. Okay, some of them are going to be resurrected to everlasting life, but all you have to do is go ahead to Revelation 20 and you'll see the others, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So there's that next resurrection, but that's to that judgment. So Gabriel continues, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and one on that riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? Then I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. Time, times and half a time. Where have we seen that before?
3.5.
3.5. 3.5 years.
In the tribulation.
The Great Tribulation. It's the last half of the Great Tribulation. So that last part, 3.5 years. Now let's keep going. And when the power of the holy people have been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Okay, so when it looks like it's at its absolute darkest and it looks like the beast is won and he's cleaned it up, that's when these things will be finished. Now, Daniel heard all this. And so if you're feeling a little overwhelmed with all of this and you say, man, I'm looking at this and there's still a lot that doesn't make sense, don't feel bad. Because look at verse 8. Though I heard, I did not understand. And then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And then Gabriel says this. He says, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. Now, got to focus now. It's verse 11 and 12. This gets a little tricky. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away. Okay, when is the daily sacrifice going to be taken away? That 3.5 year period.
Yeah.
Right? That's when the contract's broken. And the abomination of desolation is set up. That's the image that's going to be in the temple in the most holy place. From that time, there will be 1,290 days.
Does days mean weeks here? No, just kidding.
Nope, these are days. These are going to be days. So now look at verse 12. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Now there's a little bit of a discrepancy, isn't there? 1,290 and then 1,335 days. So there's 45 days added into verse 12. Okay, so Jim, as you've read up on that, what do all your scholars suggest?
At the moment, I don't recall. Sorry.
Well, there's a couple of theories. Let me tell you what I'm leaning to right now is that the 45 days is a period here between Christ's appearance in the sky and then his actual descent and final reigning on the earth. So there's 45 days where there's going to be some judgments that are going to take place. For instance, you'll see Israel. Actually, if you'll remember the judgment of the Gentiles in Matthew 25. And as we look at this, let me see if I can get you there. Matthew 25, that's Jesus saying this: when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. All the Gentile nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. Okay, so this is the sheep and the goats going their separate ways. This is the key of this is all the nations will be gathered.
Is this after the millennium?
No, it's before.
Really?
Okay? It's in this gap here. This is what I'm trying to say. There's a number difference between verse 12 of Daniel 12 and verse 11. And if you'll see that, let's see if I can get here. Daniel 12:11, 1,290 days Verse 12, 1,335 days. Okay, so I'm trying to explain the difference between. Now, notice that there's that difference, and it says that, and the key as to why this may include the judgment of the sheep and the goats is verse 12 says, blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. So there's a waiting period. And so it seems that that the judgment of the Gentiles that's mentioned in Matthew 25, that Jesus mentions in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, is going to take place there. So you remember what that is, right? You know, the sheep go onto my right, you know, you're gonna be rewarded for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. You know, I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink because you did it to the least of these. And then the goats are on the other side. So it seems that judgment is going to happen at that point. And it's a temporal judgment. It's going to be a judgment based on that's going to be done according to their works. That's not going to be the great white throne. It's different because there's no book that's open. There's no book of life opened here, if that makes sense.
So this is all before the millennium starts then, right?
Yes, somewhere in there, I think. It seems to be the case. Now, let's see. If I can go back to Daniel 12. Oh, that's interesting. I just drew on this and I don't even know how I did it. Okay.
Must have been some reason.
Well, it may have been Zoom. I may have hit a wrong button here somewhere. But anyway, looking at this, if I can get here, there we go. Verse 12. There we go. Okay, so that's what that seems like. Okay, so at this point now, if I lost you, what questions do you have? There's a lot of math in the latter parts of Daniel's prophecy. You know, the 77s and the 60, the 7 sevens and the 62 sevens, and then this last 7. And I think that's kind of the important thing to keep in mind, is that the beginning of that period was Nehemiah getting the permit to build the wall when the order was issued, and that was completed 49 years later. Jerusalem had been cleaned up and restored. And so from there, you go the 62 periods of 7 years, 62 times 7, you get the 434. And now you have the Lord riding into Jerusalem as the Messiah King. He's rejected, he's cut off. And now you've got 69 weeks, 69 periods of 7 years. And so we're waiting on this last week to begin, this last period of 7 years. So that lines up with where we are now in Revelation 13:1. And we see the fulfillment now of these prophecies in this one guy that's going to step up and be the world ruler. All right. Well, I didn't get a lot of questions for everybody else. Maybe you're just monitoring it along, checking the chat window. If you do have questions, send them to me. We'll do our best to kind of work together and come up with solutions and options, and understand that there's plenty of other thoughts on this and opinions on this, depending on how you approach end times. And again, my approach has been, let the scripture talk, let it say what it needs to say, what it intends to say, and take it literally. Take it literally as much as possible, and not try to symbolize quite so much of it. So,
Yeah, I've always thought it's been literal.
so anyway, that is that. So again, a quick reminder, this will be the last one in 2021. We'll take a 2-week break so you can enjoy Christmas with your family, enjoy New Year's, and we'll pick it up January, what is that, the 5th? I think it's the 5th. 1, 6, 7,
Thursday.
6th, January 6th. So we'll pick it up there. All right, I'm gonna
I have a question.
go ahead.
Where the point where we are right now, is it before the Battle of Armageddon or after it?
It's before.
Before, okay. Then see, sometime in there, the beast is killed.
Yep. That's going to be at the halfway mark.
Yeah, okay.
And so
Yeah.
we're gonna kind of we'll get a close up on that as
Yeah,
we pick
that's,
up in Revelation 13.
That's still a mystery to me, because he was resurrected, and it couldn't have been Christ,
Nope.
but
He
he
got
could
his,
have done it well. But some say that Satan did it, because Satan had more for him to do.
Satan
Which
is
makes sense. Yeah,
Satan parades as an angel of light, and we underestimate him to our peril. So yeah, he does have a measure of power that goes to that degree. Yeah.
okay.
Look at the way he carried Christ up to the top of the temple.
I don't know that he carried him. I think they walked up there. They went up there
Oh,
somehow.
you think they
some way.
walked up there? I thought he actually took him up there.
Well, I'd have to reread it, but I don't think that was the case. But anyway, so that'll be what the plan going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off here on the